right, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. We have Chris Pyke with us talking about green buildings and sustainable finance. If you are not aware, Chris Pyke is an environmental scientist and the senior VP for ARC and part of the U.S. Green Building Council family of organizations. ARC helps spaces, buildings, and places benchmark real-world sustainability performance in more than 132 countries. Before joining ARC, Dr. Pyke led research for the U.S. Green Building Council, served as Chief Strategy Officer for Acclima, and contributed to the global growth of GRSB, and Chief Operating Officer. Dr. Pyke is the Urban and Regional Planning Program faculty at Georgetown, and he holds a PhD and MA from the University of California, Santa Barbara. All right, Chris, take it away.
All right. Hey, Madison, I appreciate that very much. And so, guys, I appreciate the chance to talk with you guys about green building, ESG, and sustainable finance. I apologize in spades that I am not there to be with you. I think I would love to be there. Unfortunately, so would the COVID that I am carrying around in myself, and you don't want any part of that. So I apologize for that right now, and an unexpected visitor last week. So let me go ahead and jump into this program. Because I'm not there, this is me. And as Madison said, I have worked extensively at the intersection between green building, ESG, and sustainable finance. And I want to give you the benefit of that experience over the next 45 minutes or so. And so to start, I want to jump right in and tell you a story about, essentially, I'm going to do a bit of a warm up. I'm going to talk to you about 3 men, 3 years, and 3 numbers that matter to you. I'm very conscious that these are 3 white men. And here they are. So to get ourselves started when it comes to ESG and finance, regenerative design, and green building, we're going to talk about these 3 gentlemen for a second. The gentleman on the left is Mark Carney, a former governor of the Bank of England. The guy in the middle is a guy named Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, one of the largest equity houses, investor houses in the country. And the guy on the right, maybe less familiar to some of you guys, is Gary Gensler, the chair of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. So these 3 people have been instrumental and illustrative to the change in the understanding and centrality of environmental, social, and governance considerations for the allocation of capital around the world and in the U.S. over the last decade. I want to give you 3 numbers, or three years. The guy in the tuxedo, Mark Carney, he wore that tuxedo at a swanky ball, a swanky gala in 2015. And he pronounced something that he described as the tragedy of the horizon. And he began to articulate why, for a central banker, we had fundamental issues and limitations in the relationship between investors and their investments around what we would describe as sustainability issues. A year later, the guy in the middle, Larry Fink, he began a long-running series of letters writing to his customers, who are generally people who either invest in resources or rely on BlackRock to invest for them, saying that he believed that sustainability factors, as represented in environmental social governance, were a critical missing component of long-term investment decisions. And in 2022, the guy on the right, Gary Gensler, said that not only was all of that true, but he was committing, as a regulatory body, a set of rules and procedures to compel private companies across the US to provide that information to their investors. Give you a sense of their scale and their importance in this conversation. As a governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney influenced $23 trillion of assets. The guy in the middle, Larry Fink, influences $10 trillion under management by BlackRock. And the guy on the right, Gary Gensler, he is a regulator for the $48 trillion US public company marketplace. So when we talk about the importance of sustainability, ESG, sustainable finance, and green building, We are talking about a set of things that has great scale and is now at the receiving end of 5+ years of very high level, very aggressive thinking. Let's generalize about what we understand from these three men, these three figures, and these three dates. I want to give you three important facts to kick this off. The basic understanding about ESG, environmental social governance today, and its relationship to what we are trying to do in the built environment is an increasing understanding that markets fail because of the lack of non-financial information. In other words, there are critical things, many of which we are working on in terms of social or environmental performance, that are missing from markets, and as a consequence, they fail. This is what Mark Carney told us when he put that tuxedo on back in 2015. What they mean, and this is what Larry Fink means, is that market failure is the inefficient allocation of goods and services. That means that the absence of relevant information is causing markets to allocate money in the wrong places to the wrong things. And then finally, at the very highest level, ESG and sustainable finance are strategies to address this market failure. They call attention to this issue of missing information and provide a mechanism to put that information back and consequently allow markets to work more efficiently. At core, that is what ESG and sustainable finance are doing in our industry today. All right, let's take this up big picture and root this in our theories of change. We are going to talk about how these things work together. Because one of the things I hear most often is that ESG and sustainable finance are in opposition or in replacement or in some other kind of conflict with the work we have done on green and regenerative buildings over the past 25 years. So let's go up for a second and look at the similarities and differences in our fundamental theories of changes as movements. So let's start with green building, the thing we know so well. And whether you are working with USGBC or ILFI or IWBI, it doesn't matter. The issue here is we, for the past 25 years, as a movement, have had a strong and dominant theory of change rooted in market transformation. We have taken as an article of faith curves like this that we have been sharing with each other since 1993. We have understood that the market, in some way, whatever we define as the market, was composed of a range of typical building practices, market leadership, and a small fraction of innovation. We understood that we could not adequately tell the difference. We lacked the definitions, the tools, the metrics to tell the innovators from the leaders from typical practice. And we believed that when we made those distinctions visible, that the market would demand more of this and result in a permanent and self-sustaining shift, the thing we call market transformation. And the basis for that, when you bring it down to a visual comparison, is that the building on the right, 2101 L Street, and when we stand out in front of a building in downtown Washington, D.C., like this one, we see the building on the right, and if I spin around 180 degrees, I see a building like the one on the left. Visually, these buildings look very similar. They are the same height, they are the same width, they have glazing everywhere, all that kind of stuff. What we have come to understand is that the one on the right is a green building because it is the sum of sustained and multiple actions over time to make it more energy efficient, water conserving, in a good site with all sorts of other characteristics. We call these green projects, whether they are LEED certifications, Energy Star ratings, or other kinds of improvements. And in the case of this building, the one on the right has had the benefit of 32 different green projects since 2009, and the one on the left has had nothing. So even though what that means to us is we are trying to understand where that building on the left, the non-green building, is over here, and how to distinguish it from this one. And we want to use that information to address the market failure that happens when we can't tell the difference. Okay. ESG and sustainable finance applies the same concept at a different scale. The things that are durable and the same. We have a case of missing information. That missing information causes market failure. However, in this case, the unit of analysis is not a single building, but a company or a fund, the thing you put money into. And to give you a sense, there are two fundamental kinds of missing information. One, we need transparency about investment strategy. So in other words, how are investments different? Are you investing in a traditional way? And I'll explain that in a second. Are you investing for impact, like a regenerative project? Traditionally, we could not adequately tell the difference. And so it was not possible to robustly allocate resources to traditional or impact. And partially because of that, there was an insufficient choice. Similarly, we weren't asking the right things about our investments, about whether they were being operated, quote unquote, conventionally, or whether they were being operated in a high performance regenerative mode. Because we couldn't tell the difference, we had a market failure and an undersupply and a misallocation of resources. So again, we believe that when we make this information available, what is the strategy? What is it buying? We can generate a market shift. The difference in this case is that the shift is occurring at the level of an investment. And so what I want to drive home at this point in the remarks is to say, green building and ESG and sustainable finance share a very fundamental understanding about market failure and the role of information in addressing that market failure. And so I want to go one step deeper on ESG because it's important to understand a little bit more context as we unpack ESG. So one of the most fundamental things with ESG, particularly when it comes to high-end projects like regenerative or very high-performance built environments across scale, is that ESG is an attempt to provide transparency and structure and intervention within an investment context. It is fundamentally linked to investment. And that investment is arrayed over a spectrum. And what that means traditionally is we go from what we call traditional investment, where the goal is simply and exclusively to maximize returns to the investor. And then we have a spectrum where we have been willing to sacrifice return but achieve greater social or environmental impact. The extreme of that is traditional philanthropy on the other end. That means I give you grants. I want good things to happen in the world, but I expect no financial return. Arrayed in between is a set of other milestones, whether we are using responsible investment to attempt to achieve traditional returns while excluding bad things like modern slavery, cluster bombs, nuclear weapons, or whatever it might be. Or it may be that we are trying to achieve market rate returns with an impact. Many venture capital firms do this, or to sacrifice a bit of return for social impact. I'll show you a fund that does that later, or the emerging area of sort of venture philanthropy, where there is a range of returns. One way or the other, our goal is to position our investment in this space to take on compatible resources and to show the expected benefit. That the expected benefit is a function of where things are in this space today. Okay, so there are a variety of tools that allow investors and investments to position themselves and communicate in this space. These are some of the labels you might want to know about. The granddaddy of them all the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, is the general purpose vehicle for reporting on the behavior of companies and funds. Then you have more narrowly targeted tools, the Carbon Disclosure Project. You have something called the Sustainable Accounting Standard Board, and you have things like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. All of these are different, complementary, and somewhat differentiated tools to help investors understand when they're putting their resources into an organization, what are the practices, performance, vision, guidance? Where does it fit on that spectrum? Okay, the one that is the most relevant to our work in real assets, real estate, development, and infrastructure is GRESP. And so I'll speak to you with some degree of personal experience. I was the chief operating officer for GRESP. I have helped develop GRESP. I've helped scale it. And today we continue to work with GRESP as a global partner. I want to narrowly focus on GRESP because it is the system that is most tuned to communicating the environmental, social, and governance performance of real asset projects, such as regenerative real estate projects, whether they be standing assets or new construction. And so for those of you who may not be steep in this, the key elements of a GRESP assessment include the relationship between institutional investors, the assessment of a company or fund, and GRESP is a standardized set of criteria that sits in the middle. So what we're doing is acting as a bridge between the interests of investors to understand the characteristics of what they're investing in and providing a language for property and infrastructure companies to convey that information systematically back to their investors. So that is what an ESG assessment is in the case of real estate. That assessment itself is composed of what are called aspects. And so this is, you could think of them in lead speak as performance categories or something like that. They consist of management, policy, risks, performance monitoring, building certifications, direct asset level performance indicators, and the broad category called stakeholder engagement. So a couple things to linger on here. So these percentages reflect the relative importance of these issues. And each of these issues is scored and communicated both collectively and individually. So when we talk about ESG reporting and benchmarking, these are the fundamental, this is the highest level of disaggregation that we can have in going from a GRESP score, the thing we convey to our investor, to an aspect score, that's what these things are right now, and to below that are individual questions that companies and funds are being asked to do. So the next level down is to say, I want to reinforce the parallels between how the world of ESG reporting and disclosure works and our overall green building movement. In this case, I'm showing you a graph. The graph has two performance dimensions. The first one is management and policy. So a high-performing company would have a management and policy score of 100, meaning it is exceptional among its peers. A score of 0 means it's bad. And on the other axis, implementation and what they would call measurement, measured asset level, building level performance. The dots here are not individual buildings. They are entire companies and funds. They're the thing we invest in. So companies in the upper right are high performing in both management and policy and implementation and measurement. Those in the lower left are the reverse. This is the investable universe as tracked by GRESP in the year 2015. And so what you can see is that there was an array of these companies and funds. They already represented a spectrum from bad to great. Now let's jump forward in time and look at 2021. In 2021, we saw a quadrupling of the number of responding companies. And we saw a general migration whereby scores on management in particular went up substantially. So you can see this concentration of scores, and scores on measured asset level performance moved to the right. So going back and forth, you can see what I want you to see is at this point, we are measuring, tracking, and scoring whole companies, and we are seeing a transformation of the market up and to the right based on this action of assessment, reevaluation, improvement, and operations over time. So in this graph, there are approximately 1,500 companies. I think it's 1,700 companies scattered all over the world that are doing this. So this is the world that we're dealing in right now. So the question you might have, if you are not steeped in this with us yet, is what is the relationship between the thing we call regenerative green building and this thing that is being benchmarked in those preceding slides, the issue of corporate ESG? But what I want you to take away is that green building and corporate ESG are complementary theories of change, and they literally address complementary sets of issues. Green building, regenerative design, we are typically talking about creating and operating better places, buildings, and spaces. On the other hand, corporate ESG is the act of owning and operating better companies. Sometimes there is a one-to-one connection. A place is a company, is an organization. They are the same thing. There is a special category for that. Many times that corporate ESG is owns and controls many spaces, buildings, and places. Okay, let's talk about the things that flow from these two things. There are similarities and differences. There is a flow of information. Traditionally, in this space, we have things that are flowing from the corporate entity. We'll talk about an entity in a second. Those include a management team, a vision, environmental goals, and specified practices, social goals and specified practices. Those are generally flowing down from the organization and being realized at the asset. In turn, the asset is being managed and it is performing both environmentally and socially, and that information is contributing up to the entity. At this point, it's critical to understand the distinction between entity and asset in this world. An entity is an organization. It is the thing that an investor invests in directly, which is usually, but not exclusively, not a building per se. So an example of an entity is the thing on the left. So we have the entity called Empire State Realty Trust. It's a real estate investment trust. It is controlled by an executive team, and it is essentially a piece of paper saying that it exists. It is a thing you can buy shares in on the stock market. The Empire State Realty Trust controls a collection of assets, including, but not limited to, the Empire State Building. The idea is that there are attributes of the entity, a vision, policies, practices, financial capabilities, strategy. They are qualities of Empire State Realty Trust. Then there are qualities of assets that include the number of stories, the age, the HVAC systems, and the two things are complementary in that way. So to put them on one slide for a second, we have asset attributes, energy efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, grid interaction, metering, water use, IEQ, IAQ. These are things that have expression at the asset, the Empire State Building. Then there are things that have expression at the entity level. These are that management targets, the issues of diversity, equity, inclusion that are about how the company is run. And the two things exist side by side like this. Ideally, in a vertically integrated organization, the two things are synergistic and related to each other. The entity and our goal is to provide transparency, and accountability for both the entity and its underlying assets. So that's what we're looking for, and that is the heart and soul of ESG and sustainable finance today. The key thing for you to take home is that understanding is that ESG reporting is an attribute of this combined entity. the organization and its assets, not simply one or the other. And to make that happen, we have an alphabet soup of tools that range from GRI to SASB to TCFD to GRESS to LEAD and ARC and much more. Okay, so the goal, these are not substitutes for each other. They are rungs on a ladder that together express the vision and execution of an organization. Okay, I want to make this crystal clear by giving you an example for Prologis. As many of you guys are aware, and all of us have driven by on the highway, Prologis is the largest U.S. REIT by floor area, which not surprising because they traffic in industrial real estate and warehouse and distribution. They are also one of the most mature and established when it comes to both ESG and sustainable finance. And so on the screen here is an example of a typical Prologis facility. It's a warehouse facility using its rooftop for on-site solar generation and a variety of other attributes. When we go to understand Prologis, with respect to ESG and sustainable finance, we can see how this is working for leading firms today. So there are two different dimensions. The ESG dimension is saying, how does Prologis work as an entity? And Prologis extends that to take its ESG qualifications and use it to pursue sustainable finance. And we're going to bring that into the equation right now. So let's start with the ESG part. How does Prologis describe its ESG activity? Prologis focuses on the way that their company is managed, a company that maintains millions and millions of square feet of industrial property all around the world today. So they are focusing on the management of the entity, business integration, customer focus, innovation, culture, and talent. Those are the things that are part of it. And what they do is at the company level, they conduct what's called a materiality assessment to say, these are the things that matter to investors, that should matter to investors as they consider us on an ESG basis. And they prioritize greenhouse gas emissions, energy, indirect economic impacts, and their support for local communities. So these are the things that they identify as being material or important. In turn, they use GRESP and a variety of other tools, predominantly GRESP, to show their relative performance relative to other entities. So each year, they note and they celebrate 6 consecutive years of Green Star recognition. That means they're in the upper right-hand quadrant of that GRESP plot. What is that saying about Prologis? That says that the way that Prologis is managed with regard to environmental social governance is in the top quartile of its peer group around the world. And they highlight those areas of outperformance. So this is how a leading company does this. There is a different dimension to what in turn Prologis pursues using sustainable finance. And what they do is they use an instrument called green bonds. Essentially, they are using the qualities, the characteristics that they have pioneered in their ESG, but now they are turning it to achieve specific outcomes. So what Prologis does is they issue green bonds and they establish what they call a green bond framework. A green bond framework is a relationship that Prologis has established between money it receives in these bond instruments and outcomes it generates on the ground. It specifies how Prologis will take money, the process it will use to prioritize its allocation, how it will ensure the desired outcomes, and how it will report on that performance. It then pursues what's called a second party opinion, third party opinion, that this framework meets established green bond principles. That's what this document right here tells us. It says we have reviewed the process by which you will select projects, use proceeds, manage the proceeds, and report on them. And in turn, it says very clearly that Prologis will use that to invest in green buildings, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. And it will repeat that cycle to generate substantial sums of investment in its portfolio. So for instance, each of the rows in this chart are a different tranche of financing that has been generated against that green bond framework. And each one in turn is managed to assure outcomes and then subject to reporting. So to be specific, this top one, the Prologis International Funding 2, is a specific green bond that brought in $500 million of capital to improve the Prologis European Logistics Fund. And so to kind of underscore, the unit of analysis here at this level is not a single building. It is all of the facilities potentially within a fund, in this case, which in turn are individual assets. The way these resources are allocated is subject to that impact framework. And this process is repeated in Japan, in Europe, in Brazil, time and time again. This Prologis has been particularly transparent about how it uses green bonds to ultimately improve the overall efficiency, whether it's working on individual technologies or entire green building programs like LEED v4. Critically to this, it does this in a way that provides transparency. Each individual financial instrument, such as this Prologis European Logistics Fund that I mentioned earlier, has annual reporting in a green bond report. So what it's doing is reporting year over year certifications, lighting, solar generation, and connecting it to specific UN Sustainable Development Goals and a variety of key performance metrics. And so this level of trend, this is at least on a par with the very best organizations in terms of transparency about the relationship between a sustainable finance instrument, the thing laid out in that framework, and on the ground green building and regenerative design outcomes that Prologis is seeking to achieve. This includes high-level information such as total greenhouse gas emissions and energy savings and other indications that this is credible, vetted, third-party reviewed work. All right, let's switch gears for half a second and bring this to the issue to three considerations that are particularly relevant for high performance and regenerative design projects. Everything I just described to you, whether it is green building, ESG, sustainable finance, are generic considerations for how ESG and sustainable finance are working for the best companies and funds around the world. There are some specific considerations to how these things are working in the case of high performance and regenerative projects. At the very highest level, the focus on entity level ESG is great for high performance projects. We see investors pushing companies around the world to set higher expectations, more focus on performance, and in turn, creating opportunities to flow more resources to high performance projects. Those could be individual projects, they could be districts, they could be entire portfolios. So there is an energy and a vitality that comes by entities setting high-level regenerative goals and then using that to access capital and flow expectations down. That is happening, whether it's Elephant and Castle in London, whether it is Barangaroo in Sydney, or whether it is portfolios across the United States. In turn, this is creating demand for accountability from those projects in terms of energy performance, social performance, and management aspects. So there is a virtuous and positive feedback between this attention to entity management and financial sourcing that is going on the right. However, there are also three considerations, which I would bring forward to you. And I want to break them down into things that are both potential barriers, such as considerations on materiality. I'll talk to you about that in a second. Consideration, the limitations of how performance is understood. That's more of a speed bump than a blocker. And a largely positive story about new opportunities to access capital. Let's start with the first one. As I told you earlier, the issue that we have, the fundamental issue that ESG is trying to address is the provision of material non-financial information to address market failure. The issue that we have is the definition of materiality. And so materiality as a thing is information deemed relevant to investors and stakeholders. So what is this stuff that is so important that it is deemed material? Here's both the opportunity and the problem. The prevailing way of understanding what is material is established by organizations such as the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. What you're seeing on your screen is what's called a materiality map or a materiality matrix. This is a set of guidance that says for, in this case, 77 different industries, including real estate development and operations. These issues, the colored cells, are things that are defined by their group as material. So in other words, that could be customer privacy or data security or so forth and so on. And by implication, these white boxes are things that are not material, things we don't have to know about. Here's the rub. For regenerative or high performance projects, almost by definition, we are worried about kind of a two-way street with materiality. We want to understand the risks to a project that are created by a changing planet and the contributions of a project to society and the environment. What you're seeing in this map right here is exclusively the former. It is saying, what are the environmental social factors that place these investments at risk? What are the externalities? It is a system called single materiality. It basically says these things matter because these social and environmental issues are threats to are risks to these businesses. However, increasingly, we understand that there is another way to think about these connections. It is not simply the risks to the company. It's the potential to do good through a project, the very kind of good that regenerative projects do as a hallmark of their action. This dual consideration is called double or dual materiality. And what that means is there are two ways to understand this. Regenerative projects inherently, because of their focus on net social and environmental benefits, essentially require a double materiality approach. We need to understand the impact of our projects on the world and the impact of the world on our projects. The single materiality will inevitably undersell the benefits of high performance regenerative projects. A double materiality approach will better capture what we're trying to achieve with regenerative projects. For better or worse, at this moment, the single materiality framing, the impact of the world on the project, is the predominant one in discussion, with notable and critically important exceptions. So the take-home message here is we need to be careful. We want to be quick to use the phrase, we want to provide investors with material financial information. That is absolutely true. We need, when it comes to regenerative projects, we need to be very careful and very aggressive about how we define material information. And there is a right way and there is a wrong way. Okay, the second one is the issue of performance requirements. This push on ESG is increasing focus on measured operational performance. And the problem with this is a good thing. This is a good thing because it means that investors and their stakeholders are asking more from our real estate projects. And regenerative projects are the projects that deliver more. By definition, that's what they do. However, this focus on performance also runs the risk of being perceived as narrow or being where folks are wanting to reduce the scope of what it means to perform. And I want to give you a couple of examples. So our goal with regenerative projects is to encourage a holistic view of performance for people and the environment. What we face at times is demand to narrow the focus of performance. So here's a very timely example. This is a cover of The Economist magazine. And this is just from a few weeks ago, and it generated a lot of discussion. And the Economist was arguing that ESG should be boiled down to one, what they call simple measure in the headline: emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And so the idea was that a credible investor should focus on nothing other than a narrow view of greenhouse gas emissions. First, this is rich on a whole bunch of levels, not the least of which is if we went back in time 5 years ago, The Economist was full of people telling us emissions didn't matter. So the idea that they might headline emissions matter and nothing else does is a lot to take from them. At the same time, there is nothing to say that the S and the G, the social and the government, are less important or even separable from the issue of emissions. But this is what we are fighting against in the ESG conversation today. At the same time, fortunately, The Economist isn't the only view. There are others who have put in place an elaborate vocabulary to say, we want that headline, like greenhouse gas emissions, but we also want to avoid what are considered significant non-target harms. Like, we want to reduce emissions, but not at the expense of saving water, not at the expense of a non-circular economy, and we want to preserve minimum safeguards. So this schema that you're seeing right here is from the European Union Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. And so it takes a headline outcome like reducing emissions, and it layers on minimum requirements. You could think of these as prerequisites in the case of LEED, as well as minimum program requirements down here. This gets arcane and bureaucratic and highly dissected, but at least it gets closer to the scope of what we're trying to do in regenerative projects. Yet it's still fundamentally limiting. The good news is there are other vehicles that take a more that come closer to what we are trying to achieve in most regenerative projects. One example is something here out of Massachusetts called the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund. This is an instrument that is designed to invest in sustainable regenerative neighborhood design in an equity-driven framework, looking at a cross-cutting set of green outcomes, including low carbon buildings, sustainable transportation, operational health, food access, and a number of other projects. And so what I want to put in your head is it is a great thing. I'm going to go up for a second. It is a great thing that investors are asking for performance. It is a bad thing that in some circumstances, that push for performance is painfully narrow and exclusionary. Other times it is rife with rules that may not encompass our ambition for regenerative projects. But the good news is that there are examples where this ESG and sustainable finance concept are providing capital to a robust and holistic and integrative vision of regenerative design across scales. It's a thing that happens. It remains the minority of this space, but it is achievable and demonstrated in practice. The last part is this. The thing that works right now, or the thing that is increasingly working. So we have concerns about materiality, things that where we may literally not be able to articulate our value proposition. We have concerns about performance metrics, which may not encompass the scope of our project. But the good news is this brave new world of ESG and sustainable finance is providing access to capital in unprecedented ways. And regenerative projects have a huge number of options, a huge and growing number of options to access capital on a preferred basis that is in line with the amazing things they want to provide. And so what that includes on the ground is a world of climate, green, social, and sustainable bonds, and many more options. I want to give you a couple of examples to make this clear. So the weird vernacular of this world is divided among types, as an example, types of bonds. We have green bonds, social bonds, and sustainability bonds. The thing you need to know here is that green bonds are defined as those with primarily an environmental outcome. You're trying to save water, reduce emissions. Social bonds are defined as primarily a social outcome, like housing the unhoused. And then sustainability bonds are typically defined as a combination of environmental and social outcomes. And now, whether these distinctions are truly meaningful or just arcane is kind of irrelevant, since this is how market activity is tracked. So if we look at what's going on a year-over-year basis, the bulk of activity is in green bonds. However, social bonds and sustainability bonds are gaining fast, and they are being produced to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars of real projects on the ground. And so you can see that there are different ways to slice and dice, whether it is the value, $608 billion in 2020, or the number of projects that are being funded, 1,744. The critical thing for folks to know as they consider regenerative projects is those monies are flowing down to specific elements of regenerative projects: overwhelmingly renewable energy, green buildings, essential services, transportation. In 2020, COVID response, affordable housing, water management. These are all discrete areas where these green, social, and sustainable bonds are putting money to work to achieve these regenerative outcomes. And this is happening all around the world through many different kinds of institutions, public and private. You can also slice this into their relationship between these funds and the sustainable development goals, if you'd like to have a different perspective on what they might mean for you. So the majority of this funding by association is going to health and well-being, community development, energy, climate action, and infrastructure. And you can see that these are being given, or these are being issued by a variety of institutions, both private, i.e. corporate, as well as financial institutions, sovereigns, these are governments, and governmental agencies, or increasingly municipal entities. The bottom line that I want you to take from this is, in the real world today, there are increasing opportunities to access this kind of capital to fund the objectives and strategies used in regenerative projects. That funding may come from public, private, or a variety of other circumstances. So I want to close and hopefully have a few minutes for, if you have any questions for me. I know I've covered a ton of things for you, but I want to bring this back to the top. As you step away from here, folks have very, very commonly, they have questions about what is ESG? What is sustainable finance? How does it relate to green building? How does it relate to the kind of green building associated with regenerative projects or high performance projects? So I want to close by giving you 3 synergies and 3 distinctions. So as synergies, both ESG, sustainable finance, and our world of regenerative design and green building, they both address market failure, and they address with data about practices and performance. We both share an understanding that markets with insufficient information on social and environmental performance fail. They fail on first principles. We both, ESG, green building, regenerative design, we believe it is possible to use data to distinguish leaders and laggards in the market. And we believe that this act of competitive differentiation will change the way we allocate resources. It will create winners and losers in a way that drives market transformation. We believe this as a theory of change. We believe it as the power of information, and we know with data that it works. Whether we are looking at GRESP and the transformation of companies over time, or the building stock and the transformation of energy efficiency over time. Transparency, differentiation, opportunity, shared values. There are also distinctions. ESG and sustainable finance focus on entities, whether that entity is a company, a fund, or a financial vehicle like a bond. That is the focus of ESG and finance. Green buildings, there is an overlap where they may be a company. However, they are generally an asset, one of many owned by an entity. That distinction is critical. And there are different opportunities and constraints at those two scales. We also understand that ESG reporting is not inherently include values. It is a way to inform a business strategy. This is distinct from a program like Living Futures or LEAD, where values are baked into the system. It is not agnostic to outcomes. And we can talk more about that, but that's a critical distinction. ESG provides transparency and lets the investor decide the values. In green building, we have a different tradition. Finally, it is critical and important to understand that the burgeoning world of sustainable finance is distinct from ESG, but builds on its characteristics to provide support for specific outcomes that are associated with regenerative projects, whether those are strategies like renewable energy, wastewater treatment, community engagement, or broader sets of values aligned with things like the UN SDGs. So to wrap this up for a second, there are synergies and distinctions between these complementary theories of change. As we go forward, they will continue to work together to drive market transformation and to create the conditions and demand for regenerative, high-performance built environments across a range of scales. If you want to learn more, we've written and published more about this in terms of both how you measure, track, score, and communicate all aspects of ESG, sustainable finance, and high performance spaces, buildings, and places. And so with that, I sincerely appreciate your attention under these weird virtualized settings. If there are questions, I'm happy to take them. I'm also happy to put my contact information in the chat so that if folks would prefer to follow up one-on-one, I'm happy to do that. Thank you very much for your time.
Chris, thank you so much for your energy during this virtual format. I'm going to turn around. We do have a question or two. He's only able to hear you.
Oh, okay. Hi, Chris. Bill Reed here.
Hey, Bill.
Hey, great talk. Also confusing.
I appreciate that.
Well, and I mean that in a good way, actually, because I think there's so many areas that aren't explored. I'm not here to give a lecture, so it would be good to talk with you offline. But I do want to raise, while I have the mic, the difference between assets, entities, and effect.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's confusing, right? Because we are both measuring assets. We're both measuring the ability of an entity to have influence over the asset. But regeneration is actually looking at long-term evolutionary effect. I don't know if that's a but, because I think you touched on that. It implied that better than anyone I've ever seen do ESG. So I'm really thankful for that. And yet it seems to be cloudy and muddled, because you're talking about regenerative design as an object, which no building is regenerative in itself. It's the people in it that are. And how does so there, I've given a lecture rather than a question. In that is a muddled plea for help because we're muddying the market even further with these different systems out there.
Yeah, I mean, Bill, thank you for that. Thank you. I actually haven't attempted to say it quite the way that I did in this presentation. So thank you for calling attention to it. I do think it is one of the hardest to navigate and easiest to confuse. As you said, one of the questions is, what is durable? What is the unit of analysis? And what is the unit of outcome? and in some ways, I think what you're driving home, one of the observations you just made is that one of the things that's missing is the community, the people actually don't have very much expression in the way ESG and green building works today. In a sense, they're not represented. Like if you thought of this, and I won't be didactic because this is the people in the Empire State Building, the people in the community around the Empire State Building, as an example, have very limited expression in the system. The ones who are being interacted with, the entity, is clear. It's the people who it's literally the executive management team of Empire Realty Trust. The physical characteristics of the Empire State Building are also well understood, and we know how to constrain those. But the expression in the health, well-being experience of the occupants, fence line community, and broader society that is impacted by this and a larger portfolio is missing. We have tried through things in GRESP, such as there's a health and well-being module that explicitly gets into the community, but it is baby steps in terms of how we do this. So I think what I can do is to honor your observation, which is to say, absolutely, there is a hole when it comes. And I think what we are struggling to do is to define a durable entity. And this kind of goes to the placemaking culture of whether is what is the durable entity that we can interact with over the life of a place in the same way we can interact with a company like a REIT or a physical object.
So
I don't have a good answer.
There's an answer for that. There's an answer for that, Chris.
Okay.
But we'll talk to you offline.
Awesome. That sounds great. Thanks, Bill.
Hi, Chris. This is Macon Toledano from the Lyndhurst Foundation. That was a great talk. You covered so much. I'm trying to boil my question down fundamentally to the notion of the context of the market in which you discuss all of this, the purpose of the market.
Yep.
So if the purpose of ESG is to transform the market to avoid failure by reallocation of resources properly, then is the ultimate goal of the market to forecast aspects of what is going to happen in the future to achieve the same goals within the market, fundamentally investor goals for return. I mean, I'm trying to, isn't ultimately the goal of the market to, I'm just being very obvious about it. Nothing, the market is still investors investing in the market and trying to make a return. They are thinking about these other things, but ultimately they're thinking about these other things because they may result by forecasting in reallocation of resources, which has implications for their return. I mean, they're seeing ahead.
You're absolutely, so you are 100. Actually, I'll put these mug shots back up here because it is easier to almost answer to respond to your statement in caricature about how these guys see this situation. And I will also preface this to say, the prevailing view of this is not aligned with the aspiration of regenerative design at this fundamental way. So Larry Fink would very closely hew to what you said. Like his concern, that at least that he has expressed in his writing over the past 5 or 6 years, is that failure to consider these things is a fiduciary risk to the long-term performance of the resources that he is a custodian of. That is the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is a failure to consider these aspects of environmental social governance, expose his investments to risk, and that is the fundamentally important thing. He has actually gone so far as also to say, it is not my job, looking at you, government, to look out for the good of society writ large. If you look at the guy on the left, Mark Carney, he has probably had one of the more expansive views of whether the market is capable of delivering some fraction of what we need in terms of positive social change. And so his original speak, Tragedy of the Horizon, talks about the both limitations and opportunities of the market in delivering long-term performance. It also reflects his position as a central banker looking out for society more than any individual like Larry Fink in the middle. And Gary Gensler is in a very complicated position where he is trying, it appears, to take action within the regulatory context in the US, which allows him to look out for investor interest conspicuously at the absence of societal objectives. So I find where we are right now really intellectually challenging. I think there's a lot. To the point you just made, it is clear that one of the either practical or philosophical objectives is to reduce risk to market participants so that they can make money. That's the Larry Finkism. And actually, that is the effect of the Gary Genslerism. However, that is not the same thing as solving societal problems in these ways. And there is a global tension on those on these distinctions. There's so much more we could say, and I kind of want to appeal to the Bill Reed rule of saying I already said too much, but I think it's important to be very clear who believes that the right role is. It is difficult to separate real opinions from roles. So I would be fascinated as to what Gary Gensler thinks about what you just said in terms of whether markets should be asked to deliver and focus more on societal outcomes as they are in Europe. But Gary Gensler doesn't have that statutory ability right now. Larry Fink doesn't have that institutional role. And we have these ideas from Mark Carney now 6 or 7 years ago, expressing this broader platform, but that's different. So what I can tell you is these issues are the issues of the day. And I think that as folks who believe in advocating for better places for people in the environment, we need to make sure that society's risks and opportunities are in here as well as business, because that's not inevitable in the current conversation. It might not even be likely. So go ahead, please. I didn't mean to talk for so long.
No, that was great. I mean, it's a complicated question, and I think you drew an important distinction between sort of the more extractive economic market in the US versus the circular, or the focus on the circular economy in Europe, especially in places like the Netherlands. So it has so many nuances, but it's a really interesting question. And thank you for trying to put all of this in that context. I'm going to pass the mic. Thanks again.
Thank you for your question. I appreciate it. It is endlessly fascinating. I'm so sorry we don't get to have a beer after this and talk about it. It deserves beer.
Chris, this is Madison. Just one more question that I have before we wrap up. In terms of financing opportunities that you were kind of talking about towards the end, it sounded to me, I was hoping you could clarify that it's looking like financing opportunities are geared more towards specific objectives rather than like kind of a holistic standard. Is ring true to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, there are two, thank you for the question. And there are two quick answers to that. It depends on the nature of the instrument. There are two instruments that are becoming dominant in the debt space. That means that in the bond space. One of them is what we think of as an asset-backed bond. That means we say we are investing in this asset because it is already good. And that is, so folks like Fannie Mae, there are certain selections where you say, my asset, my development project has these characteristics, i.e. is green, regenerative, net zero, health promoting. That is an so in other words, that is a here and now attribute of the project, and you're going out for financing to benefit that project or to acquire that project or something like that. That can be holistic. The majority of the money is in this category of use of proceeds. And that's where you are saying, please give me your money to do, and I am going to do these discrete beneficial things with it. I'm going to certify, I'm going to do lighting, I'm going to do food security or something. It's something you're going to do in the future with the proceeds that will then have outcomes. That does tend to be more granular. And that's it tends to be more strategy focused. They are both possible. There is a market for both. They both exist. It is a little tricky to know which is which and who for whom. So just to kind of answer, to kind of put a bow on that back for you, saying, you're right that it is easy to see a table like this to say, you can get money, you can create instruments for discrete strategies and see them through. It definitely happens. There are also another universe of assets that meet different high performance expectations, and there is a market for that. They're just not the same thing. Sure. If that makes a little sense. So there are resources out there. There are investors who want to put things into those buckets to meet their values.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is the exact slide I was thinking about. Well, with that said, we do need to wrap up. Everybody, if you would give Chris another round of applause. And I will remind you that we are recording this. And so there's a lot of information in his presentation. And if you would like to see that again, just tag me and we can get that to you. But Chris, thank you so much for your time.
Madison, thank you so much. Again, I apologize for this, but thank you guys for hanging in there. I appreciate it. Take care. Have a great rest of the day.
You have a great day. Thanks.